I wanted to do another video breaking down one of the primary points from my response to ForceWave1139's article. Link to full video and playlist of other broken down points and smaller videos in the description. The other major George Lucas quote the Star Wars expanded universe was never canon crowd like to bring up, besides the one in Starlog issue 337, is the one in Cinescape magazine in the early 2000s, specifically from 2001. It seems like ForceWave has moved the goalpost from humping the Starlog quote to now primarily humping the Cinescape quote and repeating like a broken record over and over again to compensate for his inability to actually respond to any of my points.
George Lucas says this one specific thing in this one specific quote. Anything that contradicts this narrative I push in this quote does not count to me, and I will blatantly twist my brain in a pretzel to ignore and dismiss the other things Lucas said that contradict my points because it doesn't suit my agenda.
ForceWave blatantly ignores the quotes that prove my point, as I pointed out, but George has said a ton of contradictory stuff when it comes to the expanded universe, seemingly changing his mind in every other interview when he spoke on it. Link to that video below as well. But the primary subject of this video, like I've said, will be the Cinescape George Lucas quote from around 2001, where George allegedly said the EU was not canon because he called it a parallel universe. Before I read the Cinescape quote used in the article to try and prove the EU was never canon, I want to point out that ForceWave deceptively left out a portion of it and did not post the entirety of what was said from Lucas in that particular issue of Cinescape magazine, either out of ignorance or on purpose, since ForceWave only accepts Lucas's words when it suits his agenda, and to deceive others with his deceptive article that selectively cherry-picks information and quotes. Here's the quote itself. There are two worlds here. There's my world, which is the movies, and there's this other world that has been created, which I say is the parallel universe, a licensing world of the books, games, and comic books. That part right here is the part of the Cinescape quote that ForceWave cherry-picked and kept for his article. But here is the rest he deceptively did not include. They don't intrude on my world, which is a select period of time, but they do intrude between the movies. I don't get too involved in the parallel universe. So let's look at this a bit closer with the whole quote posted in context now. Many in the EU was never canon crowd, such as ForceWave, who cherry-picked this quote and left out the section of it that I showed here, immediately go to the part where George Lucas says there are two worlds and the EU is a parallel universe, so that must mean it's not canon. Well, not necessarily. When George Lucas uses the words world or universe, he is not meaning it in the literal sense like people seem to interpret. Because with George, you always have to read between the lines with what he says, and he always tends to over-exaggerate with colorful imagery and words like that. He's referring to the stories he created himself as a filmmaker, the Star Wars movies themselves. Even right in the quote, he even says that his world means his movies. George reiterated in a Force.net article interview, or at least one that was posted there, that his world once again refers to his movies another time. Another quote that ForceWave blatantly ignored because it contradicted his agenda in his cherry-picked quotes, and the ones that I brought up in my video proving George's opinion on the expanded universe was all over the place and inconsistent. It was the one where Lucas used the singular demonstrative this, referring to a singular thing near the speaker, and the word universe in the singular as well, referring to there being one singular universe for Star Wars. So I guess ForceWave doesn't understand English grammar. Anyway, it was the one where he said, you know, I try not to think about that. I have my world in movies and I follow it. Of course, that the people who expand this universe work for me, but I can't follow up all that they produce. Suru Stoney from Lucasfilm even commented on this as well on StarWars.com on June of 2004 on what Lucas was actually saying, which is that George Lucas says and sees the films as his Star Wars and the expanded universe is Lucasfilm Star Wars. Nothing about anything being non-canon. But this is what she said. He knows the comics very well. After the fact, he reads the comics. George knows more about Star Wars than we do. He doesn't see the expanded universe as his Star Wars, but as ours. I think this has been mentioned previously, maybe in other places, but it's not new info as far as I remember. That is what George is saying. The films are his Star Wars, and the EU is Lucasfilm Star Wars, and that his movies are more prestigious and important, aka Canon. I also want to go over the fact that the definition of the word parallel does not mean separate in the sense that Forcewave and the other members of the EU was never canon crowd believe it to mean. In fact, one of the several correct definitions of the word parallel means side by side and having the same distance continuously between them, or occurring or existing at the same time, or in a similar way, corresponding, or alongside by side with, always keeping the same distance, or similar or corresponding to something. Context. Let's get to the part of the Cinescape magazine quote people leave out conveniently, like Forcewave did, and read it over again. They don't intrude on my world, which is a select period of time, but they do intrude in between the movies. In the last part of the Cinescape quote Forcewave conveniently cut out, George says that the movies take place during a select period of time. He says the EU intrudes or takes place in between his movies. And as Tad Larkin said in his video, and with the actual definitions of parallel, which also means, like I showed earlier, existing at the same time, and how it works in tandem with his world, which just means his creations, the movies. So it's clear the word parallel in the sense that the Cinescape humpers believe is actually completely different than saying the EU is an alternate or parallel universe. In addition, Lucas says his world or universe, again, the movies themselves, is a select period of time. The phrase select period of time refers to a specific and limited time frame within which a particular event or series of events takes place. So Lucas is referring to things and events temporally, time-wise, and timeline-wise, not spatially or in a multiverse sense-wise. This implies that there is a defined span or duration that is being focused on or explored. In the context of Lucas's statements, select period of time refers to the timeline and events covered and seen in the Star Wars movies by themselves. It signifies that the movies are as the primary medium of Lucas's creative vision. Canon are set within a specific time frame on the timeline that unfolds the central narrative of the Star Wars universe. This time frame encompasses the events and storylines depicted in the films and the key moments that contribute to the overarching saga. A select period of time referring to the events temporally on a timeline, as Lucas says, does not refer to or mean the movies are in a literal different universe from the expanded universe. When George Lucas mentions that the expanded universe content intrudes in between the movies, he's actually acknowledging that these supplementary materials fill in the gaps, take place in between, and expand upon the storylines that occur between the films. This statement implies that the expanded universe content often explores events, characters, and narratives that take place during the intervals between major cinematic installments. By acknowledging this intrusion between the movies, aka his world, Lucas recognizes the potential for expanded universe materials to enhance and deepen the overall Star Wars experience. While he may not be directly writing most of these creations himself, as he does admit at the end of the quote, his comment suggests an understanding that they can contribute to the overarching narrative and provide additional context and richness to the Star Wars universe. This admission underscores the complementary nature of the expanded universe content, which fills in the temporal gaps left between the movies and offers fans a broader perspective of the events and characters within the Star Wars saga. Right in the part Forcewave included in his article, Lucas refers to the world of books, games, and comic books as the licensing world. George is obviously talking about the Lucas licensing branch of his company, which makes and oversees the production of all the expanded universe material, and how that is Lucasfilm's Star Wars, not in a literal alternate universe to his movies in the sense people claim. It's a recognition that the licensing world and the stories that particular branch of Lucasfilm manages can coexist alongside or parallel with the world, aka the movies, that Lucas made, expanding the universe in a way that both respects and builds upon Lucas's original vision. Ultimately, George Lucas's quote from the Cinescape magazine that is used to try and discredit the EU and misinterpreted actually highlights the dynamic relationship in between the movies and the expanded universe content, acknowledging that while George's primary focus is on the cinematic world of the movies he created, he recognizes the value and significance of the supplemental materials that further develop the Star Wars universe. It's also interesting to note that the writer of the original Cinescape magazine article doesn't use this quote as proof of or comes to the conclusion that Lucas is saying the EU isn't canon here. The writer of the Cinescape magazine issue comes to the conclusion here that Lucas is saying the future of the franchise will just be primarily licensed material. In addition to this, his own company confirmed several times that there is only one Star Wars timeline and universe, further proving what Lucas said about worlds and universes was not literal in any literal sense, as Force Wave and the other Cinescape and Starlog Quote humping EU was never canon crowd like to believe or parrot around. Keeper of the Holocron Leland Shee even addressed the Cinescape quote directly and clarifies it when it was shown to him by Star Wars fans on the old hyperspace forums of StarWars.com, confirming that there is no parallel universes in the literal sense people interpret Lucas was saying. And this was on StarWars.com on January of 2005. Parallel universe suggests that each universe can go in separate directions, which really isn't the case with regard to the EU. The EU is bound by what is seen in the most current versions of the films and by directors from George Lucas. She also confirmed the existence of one timeline and one continuity several more times. On StarWars.com, when he was asked if G canon and C canon are part of different continuities, she answered on August 4th of 2004, there is one overall continuity. In another post, she said, unlike other franchises that reboot with most every incarnation, Star Wars had proven itself over the years to be a singular universe. Everything outside of the films was collectively known as the expanded universe, serving as an extension of the same universe as the films. If something happened in a book or comic, it could potentially affect everything else happening in the universe. Any discrepancies that resulted would be resolved or retconned, short for retroactive continuity, i.e. changes from previously established continuity across the board to try and create some consistency. And on August 4th, just August of 2009, she said, Holocron Keeper does not support the notion of parallel Star Wars universes. On an interview with Awara.com in August of 2008, she said, the thing about Star Wars is that there is one universe. Everyone wants to know stuff like, where did Mace Windu get that purple lightsaber? We want to establish that there's one and only one answer. With the fact that parallel does not mean separate, George saying the EU takes place chronologically in between his movies, and his movies take place during a select period of time, temporally and time-wise, not a literal different universe, and the portion of the Cinescape magazine, quote, Force Wave left out, indicating that it takes place in the same timeline, and Leland Shee confirming further there is no multiple universes in the literal sense people interpret, we can surmise that George Lucas is not actually saying the Star Wars expanded universe isn't canon in the Cinescape quote. You can see why Force Wave deceptively cut out the last part of the Cinescape quote to fool people with his agenda in his article, Or this was just out of pure ignorance and stupidity with little research done. Now, Forcewave and the people who claim the EU was never canon can deny the last part of the quote that got left out and keep screeching,
Parallel universe, parallel universe. I'm going to hold on to one specific part of one specific quote and ignore the rest and anything else that doesn't support my agenda while twisting my brain into a pretzel. It means it in the literal sense I believe parallel to mean. It means the EU was never canon. Die mad on a hill. Those cheek quotes are just Lucas Licensing's opinion and don't count. They are lesser second-hand sources. Even though I use licensing and lesser second-hand sources to try and prove my points. Wah!
well, prove it that it means that. I challenge all you Starlog and Cinescape quote humpers out there to prove what George said at the start of the Cinescape quote means what you believe in the literal sense. Prove it that parallel universe literally means it's a second universe. And before I end this, I also want to point out how Forcewave, who complains about the length of a 2-hour video he admitted he never watched, and I was able to take that point and quote he holds on to so hard and humps. In under and around 20 minutes, I was able to debunk it. And if you can't sit down and watch a much shorter video, then it just proves my point that you have the attention span of a goldfish. Even if George meant parallel universe in the sense it literally meant that it was not in the same universe as his movies like Forcewave and the others believe at the beginning of the Cinescape quote, that means George Lucas would be contradicting himself in the exact same quote with what he says in the part of the Cinescape quote that got left out, because he says his movies take place in a certain part of the timeline and the EU takes place or intrudes between his movies in that time frame, indicating the Star Wars movies and the EU take place in the same exact timeline. This would basically prove once more my primary point that I brought up in videos before, that George Lucas was not consistent with himself on the expanded universe and is thus not a reliable source or witness to try and prove if the EU was canon or not. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed the video and I'll see you in the next one, Star Wars fans.